Hundreds of billions were being extended and none of it was flowing toward the WTA. Corporations weren't simply chasing Alex Eala, they were deserting the entire tour. A 19-year-old from the Philippines had grown more commercially significant than a professional circuit constructed over 5 decades. Not through Grand Slam supremacy, not through ranking dominance, through something far more threatening to the establishment: pure, uncontrollable cultural magnetism. And when the financial figures began surfacing, the tennis world didn't simply raise eyebrows, it held its breath, because what was unfolding wasn't a sponsorship narrative, it was a power transition, a quiet corporate revolution disguised in a tennis skirt, and the WTA never saw it approaching. Stay tuned, because by the conclusion of this, you'll comprehend why the most significant battle in women's tennis right now isn't occurring on any court. There's a particular category of athlete that transcends their sport before the sport fully acknowledges them. Muhammad Ali accomplished it. Serena Williams accomplished it. And now, whether the WTA establishment embraces it or not, Alex Eala is executing it on a scale that has corporate boardrooms from Manila to Manhattan completely restructuring their marketing strategies. Born in the Philippines, raised on relentless discipline and shaped by the Rafael Nadal Academy in Majorca, Eala carried something into professional tennis that no coaching manual instructs. She carried a narrative, a genuine cross-continental, multi-generational story that resonated with billions of people across Southeast Asia, Europe, and the Americas simultaneously. That combination, the underdog geography, the elite European training ground, the infectious personality, generated what marketing executives privately describe as a perfect cultural convergence, and corporations took notice long before the rankings caught up. By the time Eala was breaking through on the WTA circuit, her social media following had already surpassed dozens of higher-ranked players. Her Instagram engagement rates weren't simply impressive for a tennis player. They were remarkable for any athlete in any discipline anywhere on the planet. Brands measuring authentic audience connection, not simply follower counts, but genuine emotional investment from real communities, were observing numbers that made their analysts verify the data twice. Sportswear corporations, luxury watchmakers, technology giants, telecommunications companies with enormous Southeast Asian consumer bases weren't simply interested. They were competing aggressively. Behind closed doors, conversations were escalating from exploratory discussions into serious financial commitments. And critically, these conversations weren't flowing through WTA partnership channels. They were going directly to Eala's representation. This distinction carries enormous significance. The WTA operates on a traditional sports marketing infrastructure: centralized sponsorships, official tour partnerships, revenue structures designed around the collective. That model functioned brilliantly for decades, but it was constructed for a different era. An era before a single athlete could command more digital attention than the entire organization promoting her. Eala represented something the traditional model hadn't anticipated: a player whose individual brand gravity was pulling sponsors entirely out of the tour's orbit. Not through controversy, not through conflict, simply through existing and connecting with audiences on a frequency that the WTA's institutional voice couldn't replicate. Inside tennis circles, whispers were multiplying. Agents representing other players started hearing from brand partners that budget allocations were being reassessed. Tournament sponsors began receiving quieter responses to renewal proposals. The money wasn't disappearing from women's tennis. It was concentrating, flowing toward one singular point of cultural gravity, and that point had a name. That point had a backhand that could halt conversations, and that point was only getting started. Ask yourself this: when was the last time a teenager made billion-dollar corporations completely reconsider their entire sports marketing strategy? Because that moment had already arrived. Numbers have a way of escaping rooms they were never intended to leave. The figures being discussed in private negotiations surrounding Eala's individual sponsorship portfolio weren't modest endorsement arrangements. These weren't the standard mid-tier deals that professional tennis players outside the top 10 typically secure. What was circulating in confidential term sheets and preliminary agreements represented a category of financial commitment that positioned Eala, a player still ascending the rankings, in commercial conversations typically reserved for established Grand Slam champions. Reports emerging from sports business circles indicated individual brand proposals approaching figures that, combined across multiple partnerships, created a total portfolio value measured not in millions, but in the billions when projected across multi-year commitments. A telecommunications giant with massive Southeast Asian market penetration was reportedly among the frontrunners. Several sportswear corporations, understanding the cultural footprint Eala commanded across an enormous and rapidly expanding consumer demographic, entered serious discussions. Technology brands seeking authentic ambassador voices in emerging markets considered her irreplaceable. What made these proposals extraordinary wasn't purely the scale, it was the structure. Brands weren't approaching Eala's team asking how she fit into existing WTA-adjacent partnership frameworks. They were constructing entirely custom arrangements, creative collaborations, ownership stakes, branded content ventures, and long-term ambassador architectures that treated her as a media entity rather than simply an athlete endorser. One sports marketing analyst speaking to industry publications described the situation with striking clarity. Brands had essentially concluded that the emotional audience connection Eala generated was more efficiently accessed by bypassing the tour than going through it. The WTA's official partnership infrastructure, while valuable for reaching broad tennis audiences, couldn't deliver the specific, intensely loyal, culturally distinct communities that followed Eala personally. For the WTA, this reality carried severe financial consequences. When corporations redirect sponsorship capital away from organizational partnerships toward individual athlete arrangements outside tour structures, the collective loses leverage. Other players lose visibility, smaller tournaments lose funding pipelines, the entire ecosystem absorbs the pressure. And here's the dimension that truly sharpened the tension. Eala wasn't engineering this situation. She wasn't positioning herself adversarially against any institution. Her representation was simply responding to extraordinary market demand with appropriate commercial strategy. That isn't rebellion, that's business. But the consequences for the WTA were identical regardless of intent. Behind closed doors, tour executives were having uncomfortable conversations. How does an organization retain sponsorship relevance when one of its own members has become a more attractive individual investment than the collective platform? How do you restructure commercial frameworks built for a pre-social media landscape to accommodate an athlete whose personal audience dwarfs institutional reach? These weren't hypothetical strategic questions anymore. They demanded immediate answers. And the WTA, for reasons that would soon become very public, appeared to be searching for those answers far too slowly. The billion-dollar question wasn't whether Eala deserved these proposals. Nobody seriously contested that. The question tearing through tennis boardrooms was far more unsettling. Had the WTA already surrendered the commercial narrative? And if so, could they ever fully reclaim it? Silence during moments of institutional crisis is never truly silent. It communicates everything. While brand negotiations surrounding Eala were intensifying, and sports business media was beginning to connect dots publicly, the WTA's official communication channels remained conspicuously quiet. No formal acknowledgement, no strategic positioning statement, no visible effort to reframe the commercial conversation on their own terms, just institutional stillness at precisely the moment decisive action was most necessary. And that stillness was catastrophic. In the contemporary media environment, an organization's failure to control its own narrative doesn't simply create a vacuum. It hands the microphone to everyone else. Tennis journalists, sports marketing analysts, fan communities across multiple continents, and competing sports entities all rushed to fill the interpretive space the WTA left vacant. The story being constructed in their absence wasn't flattering. It portrayed a governing body caught completely unprepared by a transformation that, looking backward, had been visible for years. The internal structural reasons for this delayed response were complex. The WTA operates across multiple jurisdictions, balancing competing interests from players, tournaments, broadcasters, and established corporate partners simultaneously. Decision-making within that framework moves deliberately. Under normal circumstances, that deliberateness reflects responsible governance. But circumstances surrounding Eala's commercial explosion were anything but normal. Speed was essential, adaptation was urgent, and speed wasn't arriving. Meanwhile, individual sponsors growing skeptical of the WTA's strategic positioning began exploring conversations that months earlier would have been unimaginable. Brands that had maintained stable, mutually beneficial tour partnerships for years were suddenly asking fundamental questions about return on investment. Were WTA-adjacent placements still reaching the audiences brands needed most, or had those audiences migrated, following specific athletes, specific stories, specific cultural moments away from institutional channels entirely? The answers those brands were receiving internally were deeply uncomfortable for tour leadership. Digital analytics don't negotiate, audience migration data doesn't respect legacy partnerships, and the overwhelming conclusion from multiple independent commercial assessments was consistent. The WTA's capacity to deliver certain high-value audience segments had measurably diminished, while Eala's individual platforms had simultaneously strengthened. Players across the tour began noticing the downstream consequences. Conversations with potential personal sponsors were shifting. Brand representatives who previously referenced WTA partnership alignment as a positive signal were now mentioning it less frequently or framing it with qualifications that hadn't appeared before. The institutional endorsement that once amplified individual player commercial value was losing some of its gravitational pull. Veteran players speaking anonymously to sports journalists expressed genuine frustration. They had invested careers building the WTA's collective commercial reputation. The idea that institutional silence during a pivotal transition moment was potentially undermining years of collective effort felt to many like a profound failure of leadership. And still, officially, nothing. The WTA's communication vacuum wasn't simply a public relations misstep. It was a signal to every corporate partner currently evaluating their relationship with women's tennis that the organization lacked either the awareness or the decisiveness to navigate its own transformation. For sponsors accustomed to partnering with forward-thinking, strategically articulate organizations, that signal carried serious weight. Every day of institutional quiet cost something real, and the invoice was accumulating rapidly. When corporations begin quietly restructuring financial commitments, the terminology they use is never withdrawal. The language is always gentler. Strategic reallocation, portfolio reassessment, shifting investment priorities. But beneath the careful corporate vocabulary, the meaning is identical. The money is moving, and in women's tennis it began moving with alarming velocity. The departures didn't announce themselves dramatically. That's never how institutional sponsorship erosion functions. It happens through renewal conversations that don't reach conclusions, through option clauses that expire without activation, through partnership agreements that simply aren't extended with the enthusiasm or at the financial levels they previously commanded. Gradually, then suddenly, the commercial foundation began revealing fractures. Multiple brands with established WTA presence began redirecting meaningful portions of their sports marketing budgets toward individual athlete partnerships outside tour structures. The reasoning driving these decisions was straightforward, and from a purely commercial perspective entirely rational. Audience engagement metrics around specific players, Eala being the most dramatic example but not the only one, consistently outperformed tour-wide placement data. For brands optimizing every marketing dollar against measurable audience response, the conclusion wasn't complicated. The tournament ecosystem felt this immediately. Smaller WTA events, which depend disproportionately on sponsorship revenue relative to broadcast income, began operating under tighter financial constraints. Prize fund discussions became more complicated. The operational infrastructure supporting hundreds of players across the professional circuit. The players who would never command individual billion-dollar portfolios, but who formed the competitive backbone making elite tennis possible, started experiencing genuine pressure. This dimension of the fallout rarely received prominent coverage. The headline narrative focused on Eala's extraordinary commercial ascent. The quieter, more consequential story was what her gravitational commercial pull was costing players who would never benefit from it directly. A mid-ranked player competing in the second tier of WTA events gains nothing from Eala's sponsorship negotiations, but she loses something if those negotiations redirect funding away from the collective infrastructure sustaining her career. Several prominent voices within the tennis community began raising this point publicly. The conversation wasn't framed antagonistically toward Eala personally. Virtually everyone acknowledged the situation wasn't her creation or her responsibility. The frustration was directed at structural inadequacies within the sport's commercial architecture, and at organizational leadership perceived as insufficiently equipped to adapt. Sports economists studying the situation noted a concerning parallel with dynamics that had previously destabilized other professional sports leagues. When individual athlete commercial value dramatically outpaces institutional brand equity, revenue distribution within the sport becomes fundamentally imbalanced. The athletes with massive individual profiles capture enormous value. Everyone else faces increasing economic uncertainty. The competitive middle of the field, which is essential for any sport's long-term vitality, becomes financially precarious. For the WTA, managing this dynamic required urgent, sophisticated structural innovation. The organization needed commercial frameworks capable of acknowledging and accommodating extraordinary individual athlete value, while preserving meaningful collective revenue streams. Whether that capacity existed within current leadership was a question. The sponsorship exodus was answering loudly. The corporate departures were never really about Eala. They were a verdict on whether the WTA had evolved quickly enough to remain commercially essential in a transformed media landscape. And that verdict at this particular moment was cutting and unambiguous. The court had delivered its judgment. Now all eyes turned toward one specific interview, and what happened next genuinely nobody anticipated. There are moments in sports when an athlete says something so precise, so unexpectedly candid, that it cuts through every layer of institutional narrative and lands directly in the public consciousness like a perfectly executed winner down the line. Alex Eala delivered exactly that moment, and the internet didn't simply react, it detonated. In an interview that circulated across platforms with extraordinary speed, Eala addressed the commercial situation surrounding her career with a directness that caught virtually every observer off guard. She wasn't hostile. She wasn't performing grievance or manufacturing controversy. Her tone was measured, thoughtful, and composed in a way that somehow made her words land harder than any emotional outburst could have. She spoke about representing something larger than individual achievement, about understanding that her visibility carried responsibility toward the communities, Filipino, Southeast Asian, young women globally, who saw themselves reflected in her journey. She spoke about navigating commercial opportunities in ways that honored that responsibility while also asserting that her value, her authentic cultural currency, deserved acknowledgement on terms that actually reflected reality. And then she said something that halted the entire conversation. She acknowledged without bitterness but with absolute clarity that the structures surrounding professional women's tennis hadn't been designed with athletes like her in mind. Athletes whose commercial appeal derived primarily from cross-cultural resonance rather than pure ranking achievement. Athletes whose audience relationships existed independently of institutional frameworks. Athletes who by simply existing authentically challenged assumptions about how value gets measured and distributed in professional sports. Those words traveled everywhere simultaneously. Sports media amplified them within hours. Marketing industry publications analyzed them with genuine fascination. Fan communities across Southeast Asia erupted with fierce pride and emotional recognition. Tennis fans globally engaged in expansive debates about structural fairness, commercial equity, and institutional accountability that generated millions of interactions across every major platform. What made the moment so powerful wasn't its confrontational quality. It was the profound reasonableness of what Eala was expressing. Nobody listening could dismiss her perspective as naive or self-serving. The structural observations she articulated were accurate, verifiable, and reflected concerns that players, analysts, and sports economists had been discussing privately for years. Having a 19-year-old at the center of the storm articulate them with such quiet precision was genuinely extraordinary. The WTA's response to this interview was characteristically delayed. When official statements eventually arrived, they read as defensive rather than reflective. Measured observers noted that a genuinely confident organization would have engaged Eala's observations with intellectual seriousness rather than institutional deflection. The contrast between her composure and the organization's awkward positioning only amplified public sympathy in her direction. Social media fan communities, particularly across the Philippines and broader Southeast Asia, transformed the moment into a cultural landmark. Clips from the interview accumulated hundreds of millions of views. Hashtags surrounding her name dominated trending conversations across multiple platforms for consecutive days. International media outlets that rarely covered women's tennis were suddenly publishing prominent feature stories. And through all of it, Eala remained composed, gracious, and focused on tennis while the commercial and institutional world swirled around her. That composure, arguably more than any specific statement, communicated something profound about her character and made her even more attractive to the brands already pursuing her with unprecedented financial commitment. One question was now pulsing through every conversation about women's tennis. Was this temporary turbulence or had something permanently shifted? Alex Eala didn't start a conflict with the WTA, she simply became too significant for the existing structure to comfortably contain. Brands followed authentic value, audiences followed genuine connection. And an institution constructed for a previous era found itself commercially outpaced by a teenager carrying an entire nation's sporting ambitions on her shoulders. The numbers don't deceive. The departing sponsors don't negotiate sentiment. Something fundamental shifted here, and women's tennis will never look identical again. If this story genuinely moved you, hit subscribe because the most significant chapters in women's tennis are being written right now and you don't want to miss a single word.